What was going on in the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
Cover-ups, conspiracies, and classified research.
Pandemic pathogens are being made more transmissible.
It was coronavirus.
Ultimate insider information.
There's more than just smoke here. There's fire from different sources.
The consequences of this will be severe. Watch this space.
Can you tell us now, Mr. President, do you think this was a deliberate release?
If it was, that's essentially war.
We look more closely at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
The possibility that we're dealing with a lab escapee.
This bat video, many must have seen it before. Why has it taken this long, more than a year, for the rest of us to learn these basic facts?
The world has been absolutely decimated.
Thanks for joining this, the Australian Plus virtual event for the launch of Sharri Markson's What Really Happened in Wuhan. I'm Chris Kenny, Associate Editor at The Australian and host of the Kenny Report, 5 o'clock weekdays on Sky News Australia. In a moment, I'll be joined by the star of the show, Sharri Markson herself, as well as Tucker Carlson, the host of the US Fox News flagship primetime program, Tucker Carlson Tonight, for his insights into this issue from the epicenter of US politics. We'll hear from Sharri and Tucker, and later we'll be able to put your questions directly to Sharri. But first, let me give you just a bit of context. In October 2019, none of you had ever heard of COVID-19. But around this time 2 years ago, or perhaps a few weeks earlier, it's believed the first cases emerged in Wuhan, a city of more than 10 million people in Hubei province in China. Now, as you know, since then, there have been more than 230 million cases of COVID-19 worldwide and almost 5 million deaths. It's upended the world socially, economically, politically, and possibly strategically. The story of the true origin of the virus has been censored, certainly by China, but amazingly by much of the media in the West too. But not by Sharri Markson. Her reporting for The Australian and Sky News has advanced this story globally, even though it's been dismissed by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation and other leftist media, both in Australia and around the world. Last month, her documentary, What Really Happened in Wuhan, aired on Sky News and was the highest rating program of the year. It aired in the US too, courtesy of Fox News. Now her book is out. It's a remarkable achievement, bound to be a global bestseller. Let me just quote from the weekend review by Paul Monk, who's not only a China scholar, but a former China analyst for the Defence Intelligence Organisation. What he says really says it all. This is a first-class piece of investigative journalism, writes Monk. As a narrative and an argument, this book is a forensically compelling page-turner. Monk goes on to say, the available evidence points compellingly to the conclusion the virus was engineered in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, escaped from there, and the Xi Jinping regime has strenuously attempted ever since to cover up the whole story. If not for Markson and others, Xi would have succeeded. That is so important. If not for Sharri Markson and others, the origins of the virus would have remained hidden, censored, and denied. So let me welcome to the program now Sharri Markson's. Congratulations on the book, Sharri, and all of your work.
Chris, those words are too generous. Thank you very much. I also want to say welcome to everyone who has been so supportive of me on this journey, reporting this story and writing the book and doing the documentary. I'm so thrilled to see so many colleagues and friends and readers who are part of our community at The Australian tuning into this book launch. So thank you so much. And a huge thank you as well to Tucker Carlson. We're so grateful for your time joining us today.
Indeed. Now, as Paul Monk said, he mentioned Sharri Markson and others. One of those others was, of course, Tucker Carlson. Tucker, it's a measure of your respect that you're here for today's event. You've, of course, pursued this story relentlessly in the US. You've interviewed Sharri Markson, among others, when you've covered the story. I wonder if you can just tell us how important you think Sharri's work has been, her reporting, her documentary, and now her book, What Really Happened in Wuhan. How much has that advanced this story globally?
Enormously. And I have to say, I probably shouldn't say this, I think it's especially important for an Australian to be writing this story because, Australia is directly in the sphere of influence of China, obviously, and is a much, I would say, more imminent threat to Australia even than to the United States. And so for an Australian, a prominent Australian journalist to fearlessly pursue this line of questioning really makes a powerful statement about speech, about free inquiry, about bravery, about the basic principles of journalism, which unfortunately have been abandoned across the West, but clearly not at the Australian. So I think it's incalculably important. And then just as a journalist, seeing someone devote, a full year, the time required to already book length treatment of something like this when no one else has. Well, that's the other thing. I mean, why did it fall to Sharri Markson? Why aren't there 27 books on this by now? There aren't. And so, yes, I don't think you can overstate its importance, and I'm grateful that she did it.
Thank you, Tucker. That's really, really kind and so supportive. And again, we're so grateful to have you join us to discuss this topic today because your coverage has been incredible in the US. Obviously, your show is the top rating show in the United States, and you have dedicated so much time to calling out people like Peter Daszak and Anthony Fauci. And I know we're going to get into the detail of that right now.
Yeah, spot on. Well said, both of you. And Tucker, we'll come back to the role of Australia in a moment. But firstly, Sharri, when you read through your book, it is just so jam-packed full of so much forensic detail. And what staggered me is that so much of that predated the pandemic. Some of the research that had been published in academic papers, some of the warnings about this type of viral research, some of the warnings about what was going on in that very laboratory. Does it surprise you, having done all this investigation for a year or more, does it surprise you that we didn't know a lot more about this a lot sooner?
Yes. Absolutely. This whole debate about gain-of-function research, about the type of dangerous research that was happening at the Wuhan Institute of Virology and other labs as well, but gain-of-function research involving coronaviruses prior to the pandemic was only happening at 2 labs around the world. The WIV was one of them. And you look at scientific debate that was happening within that community dating back 10 years. And there were scientists who were desperately trying to get the word out that this research was too dangerous, that it could cause a pandemic. They formed a group called the Cambridge Working Group. They were really arguing that gain-of-function research should not happen. And then what we've seen, despite them warning that it could cause a pandemic, is that not only was it still happening, but it was happening in Chinese laboratories where we had no oversight, where there was no transparency, where there was no way for us to know exactly why this research was being done, who was ordering this research, and the sort of conditions in the lab. They were not safe enough. We know that. There were cables sent back to the United States. So there's a really big question about why we were funding this research in a lab where we had no oversight.
Yes, extraordinary stuff. And Tucker, I want to ask you about the involvement of the US in all of this. And Dr. Anthony Fauci, of course, the chief medical advisor to both President Donald Trump and now, of course, to President Joe Biden. It seems extraordinary that, of course, Anthony Fauci knew about the research that was going on in Wuhan and was actually involved in some American funding for that research, but never seems to have told the president about it.
No, and to Sharri's point that this research, these Frankenstein experiments that could really, in the end, only go wrong. The number, and you've pointed this out, Sharri, but the number of lab leaks internationally, not simply in China, but also in the United States, is astounding. It's an annual occurrence that something leaks. And the United States has a long history. I'm proud to say I think we have fairly high standards in our labs, but viruses still leak. It's very hard to contain them as a general matter. So the reason this was being done in Wuhan is because there was so little oversight. The United States Congress actually banned funding, American funding, taxpayer funding of gain-of-function research. But there was a workaround, a kind of emergency workaround that the public health bureaucracy in the United States utilized to continue it. Now, why did they do that? You can only speculate about that. But the fact is, the shown fact is that they did. And so for the guy who facilitated that to become chief of America's COVID response, it's beyond irony. It's almost a plot twist that any good book editor would remove from a novel is too unlikely to be true, but it is true. And I do think it accounts, and I won't bore you with the details of our domestic situation. You've got your own problems in Australia with COVID, but Fauci's behavior as the public leader of America's response to COVID has been so erratic and bizarre that I think it's a tell. This guy knows that he's implicated in the creation of the pandemic that he's now fighting. And it's very much affected his judgment, I would say.
I think Tucker, sorry if I can jump in here, Chris. I think Tucker, one of the things that you've repeatedly said on your show, which we could never get away with saying in Australian media because our defamation laws are so great, but you've actually said that Tucker should that Fauci should potentially be in a jail cell for his role in covering up the research that was happening in Wuhan.
Well, certainly. We've seen a number of prominent Americans, most of whom I happen to know personally, hauled before courts, charged with crimes by our Department of Justice, which used to be widely respected in this country until fairly recently, and threatened with lengthy prison terms for lying. So in the United States, lying to the government in many circumstances is a felony. And Anthony Fauci is certainly guilty of that. And I would argue a lot of other things. But at the heart of his public behavior is deception, lying, and in some cases under oath. So it's not clear why this is acceptable. Fauci is venerated by one political party here in the United States. They've doubled down on Fauci, even as his fraudulence has become harder to deny. It really, you need to be a psychiatrist to understand fully what's going on, but I've never seen a darker moment in American history, I can tell you that.
And just to add to that, Chris, I think, in one interview Fauci gave, and he only gives friendly media interviews, he won't put himself out for proper interrogation, but he did one interview where he makes the admission that he was funding this coronavirus research in Wuhan to avoid an outbreak in Hoboken, New Jersey, or Fairfax, Virginia. That just blew my mind that he is acknowledging he understood just how risky this research was and chose for it to be conducted in China. And how stupid is he that he's meant to be the top coronavirus official to the president? Well, he is the top coronavirus official to the president, but he doesn't understand that if there's an outbreak of a deadly coronavirus in Wuhan, well, that can cause a global pandemic.
Yeah, misunderstands the whole concept of a pandemic, doesn't it? Now, what I want to discuss with both of you is the censorship of this story. We know there was a lot of information around in early 2020 where people should have been onto the fact that the Wuhan Institute of Virology should have been in the frame. I certainly was reporting that case, that inference based on circumstantial evidence quite early in 2020, yet we saw this enormous censorship. But it was widespread censorship, Tucker. It wasn't just from the Chinese Communist regime that we expected. It was also from the World Health Organization. It was also from the Western media, and it was also from Western political operatives. Why this desperate attempt to crush the facts in this case?
Because they implicated the government of China. And of course, the pretext never changes. Kryptonite in the Anglosphere is racism. So you accuse an English-speaking person of racism and everything stops. And, the irony, of course, there's no more racist country in the world than mainland China, where, Han racial identity is the center of the whole project. But leaving that as, they're ignorant. They don't even know that. So any criticism of China was, quote, racist. Okay. The bigger picture is even more disturbing in my view, and that is that international institutions like the World Health Organization, the United Nations, I would say the U.S. Congress, understand that leadership of the world is changing hands from the United States to China. China is ascendant. And these are people who don't want to be on the wrong side of the new boss. I mean, I hate even to say that because it's so dark, but it's so clearly true. We've done a lot on this subject, had a lot of conversations with people who follow this for a living. And it's just clear that the instinctive response from our ruling class here in the United States is don't offend the people who are soon to be in charge. They've given up. They think that the rivalry between the United States and China over global leadership is done. China won, and they don't want to be caught on the wrong side of it.
Well, the other issue, though, Tucker, is domestic politics in the US. This was all unfolding in an election year. To what extent did the US media want to suppress the Wuhan story because they thought that being able to blame China might aid Donald Trump in his election year?
Well, that's exactly right. And Trump was famously elected on a promise of a more confrontational posture with China, to shift. So the United States has been effectively at war with Russia, formerly the Soviet Union, since 1946. So our bureaucracy hasn't kind of changed its focus. And Trump's main foreign policy promise was, we're going to orient toward our actual rival, which is China. And so this story, the Chinese unleash a devastating pandemic on the world, fit into Donald Trump's campaign rhetoric so perfectly that it had to be derailed. Trump also had made the case that it's important for the United States to make things at home. We don't make antibiotics in the United States, if you can even imagine that. We're wholly dependent on China for the source materials and for the manufacturing. So this story actually confirmed what Trump had been saying all along. Therefore, it couldn't stand.
Extraordinary stuff. Now, Sharri, from your position of pursuing this as a journalist, tell us about the reaction of other media who are either not interested in this story or actively trying to debunk it and discredit it. For overseas viewers, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, a government-funded, taxpayer-funded broadcasting corporation that is supposed to be objective, actually accused Sharri Markson of pursuing conspiracy theories here, but trying to pursue the facts in the biggest story in the world, the origin of the virus. But this is ongoing, Sharri. There is a lot of media don't want to know the facts in this case.
Exactly. And when I started reporting this, Chris, as you know, I was just writing front page stories, but straight news stories that the Five Eyes Intelligence Network were investigating whether the virus had leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And it was just straight news reporting. But for that, as you say, the ABC and particularly Media Watch, they use the word conspiracy 5 times in one segment, a show that's meant to be, the arbiter of what good quality journalism is. So we did see this extraordinary pushback to the possibility that the virus had leaked from a lab from the left media. And you'd have to ask why. Why were they so determined to politicize an issue that should be a scientific question about how the virus started? And I think there's 2 reasons for that. One is, as you just discussed, the election year. Trump came out in April and said there was evidence for a lab leak. That wasn't until April, remember. But my point on that is, what was he meant to do? Was he meant to lie to the American people and say that there was no intelligence that suggested a lab leak? He would have been accused of a great cover-up. So I don't think his intervention in this or the admission that it could have been a lab leak was wrong at all. I think he had to say that. He had to be honest and transparent. And by the way, then when Joe Biden got into office, he looked at the same intelligence and saw that there was something to see here and ordered that probe. So I think, yes, the politicization was the one reason it was treated as a conspiracy, and crazy that should infect the Australian media, but it did. And then the other issue, which I won't go into too much detail now, but of course is the public deception that was played on us by elements of the scientific community, particularly people like Peter Daszak, who'd been working with and funding the lab for 15 years, and then drafted and organized the letter that was published in The Lancet that said this was a conspiracy.
Yeah, it's just extraordinary. I'll get Tucker to pick up on that, because, Tucker, you mentioned earlier Australia's role. Yes, Australia is in the same hemisphere as China. We're very much heavily engaged with China in all manner of issues, especially in trade. But Australia was the first country to publicly call for an independent investigation into the origins of the virus, and we're still paying a heavy price for making that absolutely correct call. Yet when we get an investigation from the World Health Organization, it is headed by someone like Peter Daszak, who's actually been involved in this stuff in the first place.
I mean, that is absolutely right. And I have to just say, as an American looking south out of Australia, it took enormous bravery for Australia to demand an investigation into the origins of the virus. Again, I think the stakes are a lot higher just because of its physical proximity to China in Australia than they are in the United States. And perhaps it's a glimpse of our future, when this rivalry becomes a real struggle for the basic things like the freedom to express yourself, the freedom to get your questions answered, things like that. So I really admired Australia's position on that. I have to say, though, looking beyond the next 6 months, what effect does this have on the public's view of the public health establishment, of the news media? I mean, these are institutions that are essential to a functioning democracy. The relationship they have with the public is based entirely on trust. The doctor tells me to take a pill. I take it because I trust the doctor. Once I don't trust the doctor, once I don't trust the public health authorities, once I don't trust what I read in the newspaper or watch on television, things fall apart. And so they've degraded by their own deception, serial deception, the public's faith in these institutions that we need in order to continue. And I'm very concerned about it long term, very.
Just to pick up on that point, I think that's such a good point, but that really does extend to the scientific community. You know, we had this false narrative that there was a scientific consensus that it was a natural virus. In fact, there was no scientific consensus. It was just that scientists who disagreed, like Nikolai Petrovsky at Flinders University, he was unable to get his research published. It was knocked back from every scientific journal. Even a preprint server that is designed to get science out there quickly while it's being peer reviewed, even preprint servers rejected it because they were demanding a higher standard of any scientific research that questioned a natural origin. And so it was this circular argument where we saw a scientific consensus take hold when there was none.
Yeah, it is. It goes back to this censorship at so many levels: scientific, academic, governmental, and of course in the media as well. The tech giants as well. Look, we're going to lose Tucker Carlson soon. So, Tucker, there's a couple of questions I just want to run by you before we let you go. Firstly, of course, this was a massive challenge for Donald Trump in an election year. There's every reason he would have wanted this pandemic to be a lot less severe than it was. But I've read that you took the extraordinary step of actually going down to see him, to warn him that the pandemic, the coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic was a much more serious issue than it seemed he was treating it at that time.
Yes, and I think that turned out to be true. I mean, the death rate, at least in the United States, has turned out to be far lower than the initial projections of 2 or 3 or 5%, which would have been, even from a demographic point of view, totally devastating to the country. It was devastating enough at almost 700,000 dead. But the degree to which political elements leverage the fear, the understandable fear around this novel virus for political ends, really surpassed even my concerns. I mean, you never really thought that politicians would take a pandemic and use it to increase their own power. That's so low. I don't think the average person imagined that we lived in that kind of country. But in the end, it turns out that we did. And I have to say this to Sharri's point about the international scientific community beclowning itself and degrading its own moral authority. These are the same people and these are the same governments who, when COVID finally passes, will use their moral authority to impose a global warming regime on the West. And that is absolutely the plan. They say it constantly. And in order to do that, they're going to need people to believe that there is such a thing as scientific consensus and that their point of view is an expression of that consensus. And what we've learned in the past 2 years, and I'm trying not to use profanity on your air, but that's just not true. It's BS, actually, that these are political actors using the residual respect that people in the West have for science in order to get what they want politically. And once we know that, it's impossible to unknow it. So someone like me who kind of trusted science and like a scientist said it, I believe it, when they're on television 2 years from now telling me that I can't have a wood stove or drive a car or fly in an airplane because of global warming, the consensus tells me that I can't, like, there's no chance I'll believe them, because why would I?
Yeah, finally, Tucker, I know on your program, you've just been praising Australia in our earlier discussion, but you've had a look at the way the nanny state provisions, responses to the pandemic in Australia have morphed into almost a police state here. Now, some of us have railed against this, not enough in Australia. The media has been far too compliant when it's come to these laws in Australia. Does Australia's experience serve as a lesson to the world about how vigilant we need to be for our rights, even in what looks like a robust liberal democracy?
Well, I got to be honest with you, it's shocking to me. I mean, I work for Australians, as you know. I just had dinner with a bunch of Australians last week. I'm not an expert on Australia, but I'm more interested in it just because of my job maybe than a lot of other Americans. But like all Americans, Americans like Australia much more than Australia likes the United States. I mean, that's just true. All Americans love Australians for some reason. And I'm one of them. You know, I've always felt that way. And so to see this country that you imagine is kind of the locus, I mean, it's a country founded by convicts. So it's like the one thing you know about Australia, rugged individualism is the ethos nationally. And to see your media and most of your public officials endorse policies that are just so destructive of basic civil liberties and so crazy. I mean, with respect, it's horrifying. In other words, if that can happen in Australia, if they can tackle a man and handcuff him for smoking a cigarette outside without a mask, near no one else.
Yeah.
Like, it's fun. Where are we?
It's funny because to us, it's happened so gradually that it's not until we watch a segment on your show, Tucker, that you kind of realize how shocking it is. And it actually makes you laugh because, there was the case of the man who had COVID-19 and he went missing and there was the manhunt. And we just watch that on our news and accept it. But then you watch it as part of your segment and you kind of think, oh, that is hilarious that there's a nationwide manhunt for a man who sneezed in a lift.
In fact.
Or even Tucker, when you played the clip of Daniel Andrews, the Victorian Premier, and he was telling people very sternly not to watch sunsets. When you watch this live, you just think, oh yeah, we're not allowed to do that anymore. and then it's not until you watch your reflection and analysis on it that you think this is actually quite absurd how far down the path we have gone in terms of giving up our civil liberties. And let's hope we get them back. We have to demand we get them back. But
you got to fight for them.
We're all descendants of, and by we, I mean Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States. We are all descendants of primitive, warlike island people in Great Britain. We're all former English colonies. And Britain ruled the world because the Britons were tough as hell, really tough and independent-minded, ferocious in their spirit. There was good and bad in that, but that's who they were. And that's why they dominated. And they bequeathed to the world this remarkable culture and justice system and language. And they really improved the world more than any other group ever. And to see their descendants, which is us, you, me, Canada, New Zealand, display the spirit of obedience and cravenness. I am ashamed to watch it, not just in Australia, but in the United States. I'm ashamed. I cannot believe this is happening in my country. Where are the fiercely independent Americans? And I mean this. It's not a talking point. I really mean it from my heart. Like, where the hell are the people who founded the country? Where are their great-grandchildren? Hiding indoors because of a virus? Where are the men? It kills me to watch it.
Thank you for calling it out, Tucker Carlson. I think you're absolutely right. Thank you so much for joining this event today. I'll let Sharri thank you for joining us as well.
Just really, really grateful for your support over the past year and a half and for giving us your time to launch this book today. Thank you very much, Tucker.
Oh, I've loved it. And thank you for taking it as seriously as it deserves to be taken and for actually doing the work, unlike everybody else. So bless you for that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great stuff. Thanks very much. Tucker Carlson there, host, of course, of Tucker Carlson Tonight on Fox News across the US. Fantastic to have him here for the launch of Sharri Markson's What Really Happened in Wuhan. Now, for viewers now, subscribers still looking on, we'll continue our discussion with Sharri. We'll have a look at some clips from her documentary on this topic, and we'll put some of your questions directly to Sharri. Sharri, it must have been one hell of a year for you. I know you've got a little fella as well, your first child, as well as writing this book. On top of that, doing your day job and your Sunday night show here on Sky News. And, of course, putting together the documentary, which is now the highest rating documentary on Sky News. Tell us about how you distilled all that information from this magnificently, as I said, huge book that's just filled full of so much forensic detail. How did you distill that into 1 hour of television?
It was very difficult, and there were a lot of debates about what we needed to include in the documentary and what we could leave out. But at the end of the day, this is... Look, I don't think it's a complicated topic, but I think it's a detailed topic. And when you go into the detail of the cover-ups, of the conflicts of interest, of the unusual activity at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, how the virus might have leaked out and the suspicious incidents that actually were occurring there starting in September 2019. It is a lot of information to include. I mean, that's why I decided to write the book in the first place, Chris, because you couldn't put it all into one newspaper article or a series of newspaper articles. It needed to be a book to explain to everyone what has happened and to get that information from Chinese whistleblowers and Chinese defectors and dissidents as well. So it's a 400-page book. It is written in a narrative format in chronological order. For the documentary, we based it on the book, but you just can't include everything. And not only you can't include all the detail, but you can't include everything that Mike Pompeo told me that was so fascinating, or John Ratcliffe. He was the Director of National Intelligence, overseeing the 18 intelligence agencies in the IC, or Mike Pompeo, Donald Trump, all of them. You just couldn't fit it all in. So that's why the book is the complete story.
It sure is. But let's have a look at some of the documentary there. We heard you and Tucker Carlson talking about how much Anthony Fauci knew, how heavily he was involved in the issues of gain-of-function research and funding the Wuhan Institute of Virology before the pandemic hit, yet he wasn't very forthcoming with the president. Have a look.
Mr. President Anthony Fauci, did he ever once mention to you that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was genetically manipulating coronaviruses?
Well, no, he didn't. And, you know, Anthony's been in government for many, many years. He's a bureaucratic kind of a guy, a very great promoter. I give him an A+ as a promoter and probably a C or a D as a doctor.
There you go, just an interview with the former President Donald Trump there. Tell us, Sharri, what your sense of the president's feeling was towards this episode. Do you think that he regrets any of his own actions during 2020?
I'm not sure he's the type of person who looks back with any regret, but I think it's such a critical point that you had Anthony Fauci, who as far back as 2012, he had been writing in a paper that I uncovered that he was arguing for gain-of-function research to continue. He even said it was worth the risk of a pandemic. I mean, he acknowledged that. So he knew exactly what was happening at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But then, as you just saw that admission from Trump, he was sitting in every Oval Office meeting at the start of the pandemic. I mean, the top advisor to the president, they're sitting there talking about the outbreak. And he doesn't mention that there's a lab in the middle of Wuhan that has the world's largest collection of coronaviruses. I mean, how does he not mention that? How does he get away with that, Chris? The world's largest collection of coronaviruses at a lab where gain-of-function research had been going on. 60 papers, I found out, 60 papers funded by NIH. And he doesn't ever mention it to the president. There really needs to be a proper inquiry where he's subpoenaed and these questions are actually asked. There needs to be proper examination of his records, of his emails. We've seen scraps of information be released when FOIs have been done by the likes of BuzzFeed, but a lot of it was redacted. It shouldn't be up to journalists to be pursuing this with FOIs where only scraps of information are released. There needs to be a proper inquiry here. And it's not just China that needs to be accountable. There's a lot of criticism of China for being a communist regime, for not being transparent, for not opening up. But hey, the United States agencies aren't opening up either. And neither are the Australian ones. The CSIRO has been doing also work with the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
To me, Sharri, that's the most surprising thing about your book. I expected, I suppose, the amazing revelations about what was going on in China, and I expected China to want to censor what the rest of the world got to know. What I was surprised at was the level of US knowledge and involvement in what was going on in Wuhan. Let's have a look at another segment from your documentary that focuses on this. As you mentioned earlier, one of the reasons why Anthony Fauci wanted this sort of research to happen, not in the US, but in China.
So you don't want to go to Hoboken, New Jersey, or to Fairfax, Virginia, to be studying the bat-human interface that might lead to an outbreak. So you go to China.
How about that? I mean, as you mentioned earlier, Sharri, that shows a misunderstanding of pandemics, the fact that we all live in a global village, that the germs can go anywhere, viruses can spread anywhere, but it also shows that he is patently aware of the dangers of this sort of research.
Yes. And so what we've seen is we've seen him, be interrogated by the likes of Rand Paul in Congress, but they got into an argument about the definition of gain of function research. And in many respects, that's a sideshow. It doesn't matter whether, he has a slightly different definition of gain of function research. The point is this laboratory, and we know because their scientific papers have been published, 60 scientific projects funded by US agencies like the NIH, but also that's what they were doing. They were genetically manipulating coronaviruses because they wanted to see, and this is what they said their intention was, they wanted to see which viruses had the potential to cross to humans and spark a pandemic. And so in order to see if that was possible, they were combining genetic sequences from different viruses together, forming a chimeric virus, a brand new virus that had never existed in nature before. And they were using humanized mice to see if it could be infectious to humans. This is very, very risky research. And their virus database, the coronavirus database with 22,000 viruses, the details of 22,000 viruses, that disappeared on the 12th of September 2019, taken offline by the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They have never made it accessible to anyone, any investigating authorities. And I think, as Tucker alluded to, even when the World Health Organization went in there, they never asked to see the virus database. Peter Daszak never asked for it.
Just extraordinary, just extraordinary. Let's go to some of the viewer questions now because they're focusing on these same issues. David Halleck says that Chinese researchers appear to have researched zoonotic viruses in Australia and the US. So were both those countries, Australia and the US, unaware of the risk? More importantly, have future risks been mitigated?
Yeah, look, I think that's such a good point. Thank you, David, for the question, because I think what has happened is we've seen in China there's been Xi Jinping's civil-military fusion, where any research in universities, even if it was undertaken with perfectly good intentions, it can be misused for China's military modernization. So this then raises the question. It should make us consider our international scientific cooperation with China. And, up until now, there has been no limits on international scientific cooperation. But I think now we do need to review this. We can't keep sending money to laboratories where we ultimately have no oversight. And even when an accident or a virus potentially leaks out, we can't have an investigation there. I mean, this should really cause Australia and the United States and all Western countries to reconsider whether it's a good idea to be sending money into China for dangerous research in laboratories where we have no access.
This is why this investigation, why accountability, why your book, Sharri, is so important. You've got to learn the lessons to make sure we don't have this sort of crisis again. Let's go to another question. Chris White says, "Dear Sharri, fantastic doco on Sky News. Short of a hugely credible Chinese whistleblower defector appearing, do you believe we will ever know with 100% certainty that the lab leak is a fact and whether it was an accident or deliberate?"
I do firmly think we will know. I think every single day we're learning more information. And I was able to uncover so much just in writing the book alone that wasn't in the public domain before. Even, the most important thing I've revealed as part of this investigation was the fact that Wuhan Institute of Virology workers actually fell sick with COVID-like symptoms and they were hospitalized in October or November 2019. And that was something I first revealed in March this year. But I only discovered it because I was doing interviews for the book. So I think there is a lot of information that will still emerge. The problem is it's journalists and it's internet researchers, they call themselves drastic, who are open source researchers who are digging deep into this. There is no international inquiry at the minute, that there's nothing happening. So it's up to normal people to try and get to the bottom of this. And I think that is a problem. But I firmly believe we will eventually know definitively what happened. But as you saw in the documentary, people like Mike Pompeo and John Ratcliffe and others say that they believe there's enough evidence already in the public domain that it's beyond doubt that it was an inadvertent leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Now, Sharri, another crucial point that a number of viewers have mentioned, Michael Sherlock being one of them, is whether or not the Chinese had a vaccine for COVID-19 very early in 2020. In fact, before it was creating a lot of its strife in other countries.
So in the book, when writing the book, we were able to uncover that China first lodged a patent for a COVID-19 vaccine in February 2020. In late February 2020, I think it was the 23rd of Feb. Now that's extraordinary because it was only 5 weeks earlier that they'd actually admitted the virus was contagious, was capable of human-to-human transmission. So I asked scientists if it was possible that they could have developed a vaccine and formed the paperwork to lodge a patent for it in 5 weeks. And the answer was no. The answer was, in all likelihood, they had to have started work on that COVID-19 vaccine in late 2019 for it to be ready by the end of February 2020. So what that indicates is that they were aware there was a problem and they were working on a vaccine for it before they told the World Health Organization that there was an outbreak. And sorry to make this a long answer, but just one extra point on that, Chris. A lot of people think China voluntarily admitted to the World Health Organization that there was an outbreak on New Year's Eve 2019, but that's not what happened. The word leaked out on social media and the World Health Organization found out about it, and then they asked Chinese officials. So if that wouldn't have happened, we don't know at what point China actually would have decided to notify us that there was an outbreak of a coronavirus.
It's just beyond belief. When you talk about that vaccine that was patented in February 2020, is that the same vaccine that they use now, the Sinovac that's been effective? It's redundant now.
Yeah, so this, well, I don't know what they've used it for. We don't know. But this vaccine that was patented, that it was actually by the PLA. It says on the patent, it was Chinese military institution, and the scientist who was the lead inventor, listed as the lead inventor on the patent, is Zhu Yusen. And he then found out that, and he'd been working with Shi Zhengli at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in late 2019. There's published papers where their names are on it together. They'd been working together. And then by May 2020, he was dead. And I've confirmed from intelligence sources, Five Eyes intelligence sources, that his death is being treated as mysterious. So there were no tributes to him. No, this is a decorated scientist who invented the first COVID-19 vaccine, but nothing was ever written about his death, ever. And so this is being treated by intelligence officials in the West as suspicious, and they, as in he was killed.
Well, let's go on to another viewer question here. Sunny writes, does Sharri have a view about the decision by Chinese authorities to permit international flights from Wuhan while they prohibited domestic flights? This is right at the start of the outbreak. They stopped those domestic flights to contain the virus, but still allowed flights to go to other countries.
And just to add to that point that's made in the question, the World Health Organization also objected to travel bans. So when America and Australia and New Zealand banned flights from China on that final day of January 2020, and at the very first day, 1st of February 2020, the World Health Organization objected to those travel bans. So I think what this shows is that this was a deliberate move by China to allow the spread of the virus globally. Otherwise, they would have shut down international flights just like they were locking down Wuhan. But instead, you saw they were nailing people into their homes in Wuhan. We saw the images of that. And yet they were allowing the virus to spread internationally, which, as we know, has led to millions and millions of people dying. It's now nearly 5 million people dying. So this, I think, while the leak of the virus was accidental, the cover-up and the decision to allow it to spread was very deliberate.
Now, another question we've got from a number of viewers, Sharri, is what's happened? What about the role and what was the fate of the early dissenters, if you like, the flag wavers, the whistleblowers in Wuhan, journalists and doctors who are alerting the rest of the world to the fact that there was something going awry?
Yeah. You know, it's such a sad thing that we actually don't know the true number of people who have gone missing or disappeared as a result of trying to sound the alarm on the coronavirus in the early days. But some of them, some of the people we do know about, some have disappeared and we've never seen them again. Others disappeared for a short amount of time and then reappeared but were unable to speak about what had happened. I mean, some we saw the vision of them being arrested by authorities in Wuhan after they'd been speaking out. And one person tried to get into the Wuhan Institute of Virology and was later arrested in his hotel room. I think it's fascinating, Chris, that one of the people that I shone a light on in our documentary and in the book is a young lawyer called Chen Qishi. And he had never been seen since the start of the pandemic when he was filming videos and uploading them to YouTube to try to alert us to the virus. And then just in the past few days, he has suddenly reappeared in the background of a friend's video for the first time, missing 600 days, suddenly reappears, you know, just after we highlighted his case in the documentary that's gone global and in my book. And in the video, he says, I can't speak about some of what happened. He gives, you know, one sentence. And so we don't know the extent to where he had been, how he'd been treated, whether this was just a temporary appearance to address, you know, this is Chinese propaganda outlets, to address our reporting and whether he is safe now or whether he's back in residential surveillance. You know, we just don't have the oversight.
There is so much more to follow up. We could talk forever, Sharri, but just one lighter note from your book that I've got to raise with viewers. They may not be aware of this. We all know a lot of these coronaviruses, and in fact, the origins of COVID-19 may have come from bat caves in southern China, in Yunnan province, where the coronaviruses breed and mutate in bats and bat guano. I was astounded to read that your husband, Shaz, before he proposed to you, took you climbing around the bat cave of Borneo.
Yeah, I had to argue with Chaz about whether I was allowed to include this anecdote in the book, but he never gave me permission, but I did end up including it because it's so powerful, because it shows just how disgusting it is in those bat caves. We went to Borneo and Chaz loves hiking and doing adventurous things. I'm more of a city girl. But we went and did caving, and you do it. You have to climb up ropes and you know, moving around in your stomach in between rock crevices. And it is absolutely disgusting because the bat guano just falls from the roof the whole time. You end up getting covered with it in your hair, on your skin, everywhere. And there's massive cockroaches as well. We went into so many bat caves. If I had known how diseased the bats are, I would never have agreed to go caving. But and you have to wear a torch on your head because it's pitch black in the cave. So I had some idea when Xi Zhengli, who's known as the bat lady at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, when she, you know, talks in various interviews about going into the caves to collect the bat samples, you know, she romanticizes it, but actually it's not a very pleasant experience at all.
Exactly. Talk about going to the source. You've experienced those virus breeding grounds directly. Now, I know you want to say some thank yous, Sharri. Just before you do, I want to share with viewers your exchange with Donald Trump when you had that exclusive interview with the former president. And of course, you alerted him to your forthcoming book.
Thank you so much. I would love for Lynn to show you my book, if that's okay, the book that I've got coming out. I'll show it to you. I think she's got a copy there.
Sorry, it's just the cover of it, sir.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
well, I can see. Oh, good. Yeah. I look forward to reading it.
Thank you so much, Mr.
I look forward.
President.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy your time.
Thank you very much. Good job.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was a little bit awkward for a time when he went, oh, I thought he was maybe not going to want to have a look at it, but luckily he did say he looks forward to reading it. Although the book is quite critical of Trump's early response to the outbreak. So perhaps it won't be such enjoyable reading for him if he ever does read it.
Indeed. Away you go, Sharri.
Yeah, so if you can indulge me for a minute, I just wanted to say a few thank yous. And first of all, to our amazing community at The Australian. This is an intelligent and thoughtful community. And at a time when I was being criticised for my reporting by the likes of the ABC, you've always been in my corner. I read the comments at the bottom of my stories, and I'm truly blown away by the kindness and encouragement. So a huge thank you to our readers, our subscribers. Thank you very much. And at Sky News, I owe a huge thanks to CEO Paul Whitaker and my direct boss, Mark Calvert, who've been incredibly supportive of me personally and of course, produced this huge documentary. At HarperCollins, who published my book, the team there is amazing. I'd never written a book before, didn't really know how to go about it, and they guided me every step of the way, particularly Helen Littleton and Jim Demetriou, Lara Wallace and Shannon Kelly. At The Australian, Chris, there is no other paper like this in the world. It is the home of first-class journalism. I don't know where our country would be without a newspaper like The Australian, led by Chris Dorr and Michelle Gunn. Again, I don't have the words to thank you both for your support, for giving me the time to do a deep dive into this issue. Investigative journalism is expensive, and to allow a senior reporter to spend almost a year looking into this, it's amazing. And Dory as well for reviewing every chapter and giving invaluable feedback. And again, News Corp, this company has supported and backed this project, and it's easy now to think that this is not a conspiracy anymore because of Joe Biden's probe into it. He said that both origins were plausible, but when I started this project, it still was considered a lab leak. And I think it's important to note that News Corp does back journalism that's in the public interest, even if it's not fashionable or if it's not seen as politically correct. And that attitude comes right from the top, from Rupert and Lachlan Murdoch, Michael Miller, Robert Thompson, and Siobhan McKenna. And Siobhan McKenna came up with the idea to do the documentary when I said to her I would love to write a book on this, and also to do a podcast, which we've got coming next month at The Australian as well. And that will be some of those behind the scenes interviews with Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo. So that will be fascinating. So Chris Kenny, you're my last thank you. As I say in the book, in the acknowledgements, you are a true feminist and you've supported me not just on this, you've had my back whenever I've been attacked. I'm so grateful for that, but also thank you for your kind words and for doing a wonderful job hosting today.
Brilliantly done, Sharri. Congratulations again. It is just a magnificent achievement. And thanks to everyone watching online today. That's all the time we have for you. Thank you, of course, for Sharri for joining us and sharing your insights into how this book's come together, how this whole saga has come together, and how your investigation has got to the heart of it. I can't overstate what an impressive, diligent, and courageous journalistic work that Sharri has produced here.
Thank you,
so it's been an honour for me to be involved in this event. Thanks again also to Tucker Carlson once more for joining us earlier. What an honour that was, and a tribute to Sharri as well. But a special thank you to, of course, our subscribers, our viewers now, for spending this time with us and for sending in so many pertinent questions. We really appreciate your continued support of everything we do here at The Australian and Sky News. If you haven't already got your copy of what really happened in Wuhan, head to theaustralianplus.com.au where you'll find a discount offer from Booktopia available exclusively to subscribers of The Australian. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great day. And again, Sharri Markson, congratulations.
Thank you, Chris.